The legends rarely tell the same story twice. This is just one of them.
Before the genie became blue.
Before it lived inside a golden lamp. Before it smiled, cracked jokes, and granted 3 wishes, there was the Jinn. Not a fairy, not exactly a demon, and certainly not a magical servant waiting centuries for someone to rub the right piece of metal. The Jinn belonged to a far older and stranger tradition, one that stretches from the deserts of pre-Islamic Arabia through the Qur'an and Islamic theology into medieval folklore, occult literature, ghost stories, and eventually the pages of the 1001 Nights. And somewhere along that journey, the Jinn became the genie. But the creature that existed before the lamp was something very different, something invisible, something intelligent, and, perhaps most unsettling of all, something believed to be living alongside us. The Arabic word jinn is traditionally associated with the root jinn, a family of words connected with concealment and things hidden from sight. Medieval Arabic lexicographers therefore understood the name as referring to beings concealed from human senses. The concept itself predates Islam, although reconstructing exactly what pre-Islamic Arabs believed is difficult because much of the surviving evidence was written down later. What is clear is that supernatural beings called jinn were already part of Arabian imagination before Islam. And they were not necessarily monsters. They seem to have occupied a strange territory somewhere between spirit, invisible person, wilderness being, and supernatural intelligence. Old Arabian traditions connected supernatural beings with desolate landscapes, divination, poetry, and extraordinary inspiration. Later writers also preserved the belief that poets and soothsayers might receive words from invisible companions. Then, in the 7th century, the Qur'an transformed the jinn from scattered supernatural folklore into something much more clearly defined. In the Quranic universe, humanity is not the only intelligent creation. There are angels, there are humans, and there are jinn. The Qur'an describes humankind as created from clay, while the jinn are associated with fire, more specifically with expressions translated as a scorching or smokeless flame. A later authentic hadith in Sahih Muslim repeats the distinction: angels from light, jinn from fire, and Adam from the material described for him. But fire does not make the jinn automatically evil. That distinction is extremely important. In popular Western culture, supernatural beings are often separated into neat moral categories. Angels are good, demons are evil. The jinn do not fit that model. The Qur'an presents them as morally responsible beings capable of belief and disbelief, obedience and rebellion. In Surah Al-Jinn, a group of jinn describe themselves as divided, some righteous, others not. Some submit to God, others act unjustly. They hear revelation, judge it, discuss it, and choose whether to accept it. In other words, they appear to possess something humans also possess: free will. The Qur'an even places humans and jinn together when describing beings created to worship God. So the jinn are not simply Islamic demons. Some may be hostile, some may be righteous, some may be indifferent. And this brings us to one of the most famous figures in Islamic tradition, Iblis, the being who refuses God's command concerning Adam. In later comparisons, Iblis is often equated with Satan, but there is an important Quranic detail that is frequently overlooked. Surah Al-Kahf states explicitly that Iblis was one of the jinn. This is one reason the categories jinn, shaitan, and demon should not simply be treated as synonyms. A jinn is a kind of being. A shaitan, roughly a devilish or rebellious being, is more of a moral description. The Qur'an can even speak of devils among both humans and jinn. So an evil jinn may be a shaitan, but not every jinn is one. And if that already complicates the familiar picture, there is another figure hiding inside the Qur'an that later became a monster in its own right. The Ifrit. In the story of Solomon, or Suleiman, the Qur'an describes an Ifrit from among the Jinn, offering to bring the throne of the Queen of Sheba before Solomon rises from his place. The passage gives us two things. First, an Ifrit is explicitly connected to the Jinn. Second, at least this particular being is depicted as possessing extraordinary strength or speed. But notice what the Qur'an does not give us. It does not describe an elaborate zoological classification of Ifrits. It does not tell us that every Ifrit has horns, wings, red skin, a particular rank, or a specific elemental power. Much of the detailed taxonomy found on modern mythology websites comes from later folklore rather than the Qur'an itself. That difference matters. Solomon is one of the central human figures in Jinn tradition. The Qur'an describes Jinn working under his authority. They perform labor for him, and his forces include humans, birds, and Jinn. Later Islamic and folkloric traditions dramatically expanded this relationship, until Solomon became the archetypal ruler capable of commanding supernatural beings. Eventually, stories developed around magical rings, seals, talismans, and the famous Seal of Solomon. And this is where one of the most recognizable genie motifs begins to emerge, the supernatural creature imprisoned inside a container. But the Qur'an itself never says that Jinn naturally live in lamps. That comes much later. There is another detail in Solomon's story that tells us something surprisingly important about what Jinn cannot do. When Solomon dies, the Jinn working for him do not immediately realize it. According to the Quranic account, his death only becomes apparent after the staff supporting his body is eaten away and he falls. The point of the story is explicit. Had the Jinn possessed knowledge of the unseen, they would not have continued laboring in ignorance. So, although later legends often give Jinn extraordinary knowledge, prophecy, secrets, hidden treasure, forbidden information, the Qur'an does not present them as omniscient. They may know things humans do not, but they do not automatically know the unseen or the future. Their relationship with Muhammad is also unusually direct. The Qur'an describes a group of Jinn hearing its recitation and reacting to it with astonishment. They listen, recognize what they believe to be divine revelation, and then return to their own people as warners. This is remarkable because it depicts the Jinn not simply as objects of human fear, but as an audience. They listen. They reason, they communicate, they have communities of their own. And the Hadith tradition expands this episode even further. In Sahih Muslim, Muhammad is described as going with a messenger from the Jinn and reciting the Qur'an to them. Afterwards, traces of their fires are shown to his companions. The Jinn ask about their food, and the narration associates bones with their provision and animal dung with food for their animals, which leads to a bizarre implication. Traditional accounts do not describe the Jinn as abstract ghosts floating outside the physical world. They eat. They have animals. They form communities. They communicate. And other traditions describe something even more intimate, a qareen. According to another narration in Sahih Muslim, every human being has an accompanying being from among the Jinn, a companion, a presence attached to the individual. Later tradition interprets the qareen in different ways, often connecting it with temptation or whispered impulses. It is a far more unsettling image than a genie in a lamp. Not a creature waiting somewhere in a forgotten cave, but one that accompanies a human life. Then there is the question everyone eventually asks: what does a jinn look like? And the frustrating answer is, there is no single canonical appearance. The Qur'an never provides the equivalent of a monster manual. Later traditions describe jinn taking many forms: humans, animals, terrifying hybrids, enormous figures, or creatures difficult to describe at all. Snakes became particularly important in some traditions. There are hadith reports connecting certain snakes found in houses with jinn. One version in Sunan Abi Dawud explicitly says that some snakes are jinn, although the specific narration numbered 5,256 is graded weak by Al-Albani, while related snake traditions occur through other transmission chains as well. This is a good example of why individual folklore claims need to be handled carefully rather than presented as universally established doctrine. Later folklore became much more extravagant. Jinn could appear beautiful or monstrous, male or female, gigantic or nearly invisible, human except for some disturbing flaw, animal-like, winged, hairy, blackened, smoke-like, or able to shift between forms entirely. And as Islam spread across enormous territories, local supernatural traditions fused with the concept of the jinn. Persian traditions mixed jinn with beings such as the div and pari. Elsewhere, older local spirits were reinterpreted as jinn. The result is not one single folklore. It is a family of related traditions stretching across North Africa, the Middle East, Persia, South Asia, and Southeast Asia. This also explains why lists of supposedly fixed types of jinn should be treated cautiously. You may have heard names like Ifrit, Marid, ghoul, shaitan. Perhaps even elaborate hierarchies assigning each one powers, colors, elements, and ranks. Some of those names are ancient, but the neat classification systems are usually not. An Ifrit appears in the Qur'an. A ghoul belongs strongly to Arabic and Persian folklore and became associated with wilderness, shape-changing, and predatory behavior. Shaitan refers to a devilish or rebellious being and is not simply another biological species of jinn. The Marid, meanwhile, became famous in later literary and folkloric tradition as an especially powerful supernatural being, but the modern fantasy idea of a clean hierarchy, ordinary jinn, then Ifrit, then Marid, as though they were levels in a game, is not a reliable representation of early Islamic sources. And the ghoul deserves special attention. Long before modern fantasy turned the word into a generic undead monster, Arabic folklore imagined the ghoul as something far stranger. A dangerous being associated with lonely places, wilderness, and deception. Some accounts portray it as a shapeshifter, some as a predator, some as something capable of misleading travelers in the desert. Traditions overlap with the world of the jinn, although the two categories are not always identical. And once again we see the same pattern. Islamic theology gives us one layer, folklore builds another, literature adds another still. The landscape of the jinn is equally important. Later folklore repeatedly places them in locations human beings find uncomfortable or liminal. Deserts, ruins, caves, wells, abandoned buildings, dark places, graveyards, bathhouses, places associated with waste or impurity, crossroads, and wilderness. The exact list changes from region to region, which is why these should be understood as folklore rather than universal Islamic doctrine. But the theme is remarkably consistent. Jinn belong to spaces at the edge of human control, the places where civilization ends, where light disappears, where people rarely remain after dark, and sometimes they live much closer, inside houses, beside human settlements, or invisibly within the same landscape humans believe belongs only to themselves. This invisible coexistence is probably one of the defining ideas of the entire tradition. Humans inhabit one world, the jinn inhabit another, and the two overlap. Most of the time they remain separate, but folklore is filled with stories about what happens when that boundary fails. A human accidentally harms a jinn becomes obsessed with a human. Someone enters a place believed to belong to them. A person pours water somewhere without warning. A traveler sleeps in the wrong place. A house becomes disturbed. A jinn falls in love. And in some later traditions, even marriage between humans and jinn becomes possible. Medieval literature preserves stories of human-jinn relationships, abductions, lovers, and even supposed offspring. Such stories were widespread enough that scholars recorded traditions claiming certain families or tribes possessed jinn ancestry. These are not Quranic doctrines. They belong to the vast secondary world that grew around the jinn. Then we reach one of the darkest parts of the tradition: possession. Belief that jinn can influence or enter human beings became widespread in many Muslim societies, although interpretations vary greatly between scholars, communities, and historical periods. Episodes interpreted as jinn possession have been associated with unusual behavior, seizures, voices, nightmares, emotional distress, or psychiatric symptoms. Modern medical researchers do not treat supernatural possession as an empirically established diagnosis. Instead, they study belief in jinn as a powerful cultural and religious framework through which people may interpret distress or mental illness. And that distinction is important. A historian can say that people believed a jinn caused an illness. An anthropologist can document a possession ritual. A psychiatrist can document a patient who understands their symptoms as jinn possession. None of those statements scientifically proves that an invisible being caused the illness. But the belief itself remains culturally very real and can strongly shape how people seek treatment. Across different regions, protective practices developed alongside these fears. Quranic recitation, prayer, amulets, invocations, sacred writing, protective objects. Later magical traditions also produced enormous bodies of occult literature describing attempts to communicate with, bind, or command supernatural beings. Some were framed as religiously legitimate, others were condemned as sorcery. And the boundary between theology, folk religion, and magic was often fiercely disputed. But perhaps no object became more famous than the seal associated with Solomon. Because once Solomon became the great ruler of spirits in popular imagination, it was only a small step to imagine that his seal could imprison them. And from there, we finally reach the bottle. In the 1001 Nights, one of the most famous jinn stories begins with a fisherman pulling a sealed copper vessel from the sea. He opens it, smoke pours out, the smoke grows, and from it forms an enormous supernatural being. The jinn explains that he rebelled against Solomon and was imprisoned inside the vessel, sealed by Solomon's power and thrown into the sea. Centuries pass. At first, the imprisoned being promises riches to whoever releases him, then greater rewards. Eventually, after waiting too long, gratitude turns into rage. He decides that whoever finally frees him will be killed instead. The fisherman survives not through magical power, but through intelligence. He convinces the enormous jinn that something so large could never have fit inside such a small vessel. The offended creature transforms back into smoke and enters the container to prove it, and the fisherman seals it again. That story gives us many elements now inseparable from the genie: smoke, a container, imprisonment, enormous size, supernatural rewards, and the power of Solomon. But notice something fascinating. This is not yet the friendly, wish-granting genie. The creature may offer rewards, but it is dangerous, proud, violent, and perfectly willing to murder the person who releases it. And then came Aladdin, perhaps the most famous Arabian Nights story in the world. Except its history is stranger than most people realize. The story of Aladdin was not part of the medieval Arabic manuscript tradition from which Antoine Galland originally translated the 1001 Nights. Galland, the French translator whose enormously influential edition began appearing in the early 18th century, learned the story from Hannah Diab, a young Maronite Christian storyteller from Aleppo. Galland incorporated it into his collection. The story eventually became so famous that most people now assume it had always been one of the central Arabian Nights tales. And from Aladdin's magical lamp came the most powerful image of the jinn in modern Western culture. Even here, however, the modern stereotype took time to form. Early European illustrations did not necessarily depict genies as blue, floating cartoon spirits. 18th and 19th century European translators and artists gradually constructed their own visual language of the Orient: exotic palaces, turbans, deserts, enormous magical slaves, and mysterious Eastern sorcery. The Jinn became the genie, and the genie gradually became detached from its religious and folkloric origins. Eventually, the creature was simplified into a formula almost everyone recognizes: a lamp, 3 wishes, a magical servant, perhaps some rules, perhaps a joke about wishing for more wishes. But none of that is a basic description of the Jinn in the Qur'an. The universal 3-wish rule is not Quranic doctrine. Living naturally inside lamps is not Quranic doctrine. Being forced to obey whoever owns a lamp is not Quranic doctrine. And Jinn are certainly not universally benevolent wish machines. The modern genie is therefore almost a descendant of the Jinn rather than the Jinn itself. A cultural transformation. An ancient supernatural category passed through religion, folklore, storytelling, translation, European Orientalism, children's literature, theatre, animation, and finally, global popular culture. And beneath all of that still exists the older creature, a being made from fire, usually hidden from human perception, capable of intelligence and belief, neither automatically good nor automatically evil, able, according to centuries of tradition, to frighten, deceive, inspire, love, whisper, travel, worship, rebel, and sometimes interact with human beings. A creature whose world exists beside ours, or perhaps within it. And that may be the reason the Jinn survived while so many other ancient spirits disappeared. Because the Jinn were never confined to the distant past. They were never only monsters defeated by legendary heroes. Within living traditions, they did not vanish when the story ended. They remained. In abandoned buildings, in deserts, in whispered warnings, in religious texts, in family stories, in unexplained experiences, and eventually, inside a lamp. So the next time a story tells you that somewhere inside an old brass vessel waits a cheerful spirit ready to grant 3 wishes, remember what came before it. Because before the genie was a servant, it was something humans were warned not to disturb. Something that could believe, something that could rebel, something that could listen from the darkness, something hidden from sight. The Jinn. And this is the Voices of Mimir.